biggest change that has happened in kind of political terms has been a generational polarisation such as we have never, ever before seen in this country. That really should be telling us more than I think we're currently listening to about it. Now, there are lots of other huge changes, of course there are, but some of them I would have anticipated, like Vladimir Putin turning out to be an extremely bad thing indeed. I just didn't think he was a foolish thing as well, and so on. But I think the biggest thing really has been, I suppose I feel a sense of generational guilt.
Excitement. Excitement the right word? Of the Windsor framework? Are you excited?
Which should I be more excited by, the Windsor framework or the Stormont break?
Well, one is part of the other.
Yeah, okay, so I was struck this morning by Rishi Sunak saying how wonderful this was for Northern Ireland, because now they would not only have access to the UK market, but also, he said, access to the European single market, which makes them a wonderful place for investors. And I thought, did you hear yourself just say that, given that you were one of the major campaigners to leave the European single market? And I thought, yeah, this is a good deal for Northern Ireland, whatever the DUP says, because no one has seriously questioned the Northern Ireland's role in the United Kingdom. That was always a kind of chimerical thing, which was very big for them. But now, if I was going to have a business making something and situate it anywhere in the United Kingdom, I'd go to Northern Ireland, because it's going to be a brilliant place to be. And also, just before you anticipate your question, I don't think Boris Johnson will oppose this, because I think Boris Johnson understands perfectly well by now that there is no vote to be gained, certainly not in the United Kingdom, in the rest of the United Kingdom, from opposing this deal. And it'll go through, and it'll go through quickly, I think.
We'll come on to Boris in a minute, but somebody's tweeting called the real Professor T says, if the New Deal keeps Northern Ireland the single market and retains UK sovereignty, why can't the whole of the UK have it, Danny? Which is an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, look, it certainly raises some questions for Rishi Sunak about his support for Brexit, without any doubt. But it does show a number of other things. And just to even up the scales, one of the things it demonstrates is that the European Union was capable of moving from its position. So something that was argued is essentially there were a number of things that EU offered. They would take it or leave it. There wasn't a solution to the problem we had in Northern Ireland, albeit that it was a problem that we created by the decision we made over Brexit. And this does show that that's not the case. However, it only shows it because the Britain has moved from its position of trying to goad the European Union into making concessions, something that was never, ever going to work. And actually, it begun this with David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, with the suggestion to him that his way of working should be to say he was going to introduce Article 50, which was one of Owen Paterson's brilliant ideas. And it has gone all the way through, and the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill was another example of that. And this just illustrates that approach doesn't work. And that's not, to my mind, a surprise. So I found, weirdly, I'm writing about this for tomorrow now, weirdly, at the same time as thinking this was a great triumph, I found myself quite annoyed that it's taken us all this time to learn what seemed to me to be fairly simple lessons, like it might be a good idea to read pieces of treaty that you're about to sign.
He's so old-fashioned in his ways.
I know, he just will not adopt the Nigel Farage approach, which is, who cares, it's got the name court in it and European in it, and as far as I'm concerned, therefore it's all bad.
To be fair to him, I haven't heard this particular clip, so I can't speak for myself. I'm relying on what we've just been told, but it is pretty extraordinary.
After all this time.
Well, that somebody who invests a lot of importance in our freedom from the European Court of Justice doesn't actually know what it is. And it does suggest a fundamental lack of seriousness about the real implications of dealing with these bodies, which I don't think is unreasonable, for his critics to point out. Let's put it that way.
And on the question of Boris Johnson, because it's quite by being as un-Boris Johnson as possible, Rishi Sunak didn't really talk about what he was doing. Got very cross when the Times reported even little bits of what he'd got, because he wanted nothing happening in public, no big public row, clearly wooing Ursula von der Leyen and other European leaders. And by being nice and professional and pragmatic, he's ended up getting a deal. But in doing so, has he finished off Boris Johnson?
Well, who knows? I never think that's the case at any point, and I've certainly neither does he. But I do think one of the things that we talked about with the difference between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson was always either ideological or personal ambition, but people left out a very important feature of the difficulty of their relationship, which is their very different working methods. I think Rishi Sunak found Boris chaotic, You couldn't rely on anything he said at one time or another. The meetings would meander on. The one meeting would contradict the meeting before it. You could see the negotiating strategies were wayward. It was their very different personal styles were as much responsible for their falling out as anything else.
Yeah, I mean, one is a head boy of a major public school, and the other one would never be head boy or even prefect. He'd just kind of pass on. I mean, Sunak is a very, very different character from Boris Johnson, but I think politically, I do think he's almost certainly cut the ground from underneath him, at least for the time being. And in any party other than the Conservative Party, actually forever. Because, as I said, there just isn't a constituency for Borisism in the country. And sooner or later, most Conservatives will twig to the fact that that means there shouldn't really be that much of one in the Conservative Party either. And kind of realism kind of suggests, and self-interest suggests, that they will arrive at that point, and maybe they have just now.
When it's extraordinary, it was only, a week or so ago when friends of Boris Johnson were telling the papers he was going to use this bill to challenge Rishi Sunak for the premiership. It's amazing. Now look, he's the only person who hasn't spoken about it.
Don't you think that that's a kind of fits into the category of just a kind of little try on? You just stick it out there and see what the reaction is, and the reaction is, "Oh, do go away."
Yeah, one of the things there are a number of things about the statement friends of Boris Johnson. First of all, I think he's one of those people who's like quite popular with lots of people, but doesn't actually have very many friends. He has some kind of temporary political allies. I'm not convinced he necessarily told them that I'm going to use that. A lot of times they'll have been rung up and say, "What do you think Boris thinks?" He won't have said anything, but they don't want to look stupid. They probably haven't spoken to him for a month. And then they tell him whatever the journalist has asked in the first place in order to look as though they're in on the act. So I don't trust those kind of references that much.
No, I completely agree. But our Westminster colleagues are forced upon them.
As a general, I always assume that friends of is the person. Source close to might be a SPAD or something, but friends of I assumed is the person themselves.
Well,
allies of?
Allies, sort of halfway.
Right.
Somebody who agrees with them who definitely hasn't spoken to them.
Could be. I remember once years ago, I was in politics and I rang somebody who'd been referred to as a kind of female MP, and I said, I thought that person out. It was a brilliant insight. And he goes, "It was you idiot."
We were just talking about what's happened to Rishi Sunak and how this is a vindication for boring, dull competence. But actually it sets up, Danny, an election where two people who are boring and dull and but potentially competent lay out their plans, and then the public can decide on them.
Yeah, I think it does. And the last time was a very difficult election campaign for a lot of people. It had a choice at the end of the day between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. I had never had any doubt as to what I was going to do in an election like that. I mean, fun if I can't vote because I'm a peer, but I never had any doubt what I wanted to be the outcome of that election. But it didn't give me any great pleasure. At one point, I thought there was going to be a choice between No Deal and Jeremy Corbyn. Even more difficult was I thought No Deal was a completely unconscionable thing, but so was Corbyn.
So do you think politics is getting a bit more sensible, David?
It looks to me like the kind of populist moment has passed. But that doesn't mean that the Conservative Party, and maybe also Labour, will be prey to kind of populist impulses. I mean, the whole stuff about Rishi Sunak's continuous stuff about stopping the boats coming when he doesn't actually have the policies to do it. At a point when actually both parties are prepared, for example, to embrace the idea that immigration on a large scale is actually a good thing and something that we need and is going to happen anyway, then I will know that the populist impulse has really passed. But it does seem, I do think that people are, especially after the pandemic, will value competence more. And it'll be very interesting to see how Sunak and Starmer develop their antagonistic relationship and what kind of antagonistic form it takes. Because you've still got people in the Conservative Party, and I think probably on the edge of the Labour Party, who say, do whatever it is, this section of the voters tickles them and so on. And that's not, and then you can't do it. It won't work.
And then you become a hostage to fortune.
Then you become a hostage to fortune, and then people lose trust again.
And to some extent, if you're going to win anyway, don't make yourself a hostage to lots of little fortunes like that. Well, let's look more broadly at trust. There's a new survey out today looking at trust. I think it was done at the end of January, so things have moved on a little bit, but not a lot. Trust in the government is at its lowest level since 2016, at just 27%. 68% said politicians were more likely to lie. 77% said they were making things worse. 80% said they're making the country more divided. Rishi Sunak's trust ratings down 10 points to 25%. Keir Starmer trusted by only 31%. Maybe will this start to... I mean, Or is it ever the case, Danny?
I think this may be the only case where one of your guests has actually answered the question a whole week before you asked it. Because if you remember last week,
yes.
you asked me whether I had any faith in politics.
There was a Ronnie Barker and Ronnie Corbett sketch like that, wasn't there?
You asked me
the question the week before the feature.
whether one could have faith in politics. That was it. And I interpreted that as a question about trust in politics rather than about religious faith. So I've answered that, which is that I while being aware of the public mood towards politicians and understanding the reason for it, if you, for example, in some of my, business work, you're required to have by regulation, to have much greater precision about the things that you say, and to insist that they be realistic and that they be fair and balanced and are informed. And you don't have that in politics. So I understand. And also politicians promise people sometimes things that they want that then ultimately turn out to be not practical or not possible. And that has eroded trust in politicians. But I do think it's important that people don't make sweeping judgments about politicians. Otherwise, when somebody decides to decorate their flat with pound notes provided by the party donor, they no longer are able to tell the difference between that and maybe saying something a little too over exuberant about boats.
Yeah, David.
Yeah, there's always been a large section of the electorate that has always said politicians are all in it for themselves, and etc. Essentially, because politicians go about the grubby business of asking you for something and trying to get it from you by persuasion, and sometimes that persuasion is not entirely kind of fact-based, etc. And people suspect them on the basis that they are kind of making those requests. The problem has been that a significant additional group of people, I think, has probably become to the distrust side. A large number of them as a consequence of the Brexit campaign and what happened subsequently in the sort of what you might call the educated middle classes, who might before have taken a more nuanced approach. I mean, maybe they didn't, and I'm not totally across the facts here, etc. I'm just speculating that this has been an additional kind of section which has been added, and maybe some experience of decent politics for a while will change some of that bit round. But for a lot of young people, for example, and we've touched on this occasionally, things are difficult enough, and politics offers them little enough, or has offered them little enough, for us to think that maybe something's got to change in that before they're going to turn around and say, yeah, we kind of quite like you again, or we trust you again.
I suppose, is there something about social media and young people being more engaged with issues? A collective, they're more aware there are lots of people who agree with them and their age. But that then isn't reflected because, as a rule, older people vote and look after the pensioners and all that sort of thing. That plays out like that. So they feel even more aggrieved. They're more engaged collectively on social media and that sort of thing. But they then feel even more ignored.
Yeah, well, that makes some sense. But we've actually been saying that for a long time. Actually,
my son said to me on the question of capitalism and young people's support or failure to support capitalism. He said, "You're always trying to give people an argument when what they're after is a house," and I think that's very perceptive.
Dad,
I think that's very perceptive. In other words, a lot of trust in politics and the political atmosphere and belief in fundamental things like property law and things like that is driven by whether everybody feels that they benefit to some degree out of it. I think this is a commonality between David and I might disagree sometimes about how we do that, but a commonality between us is that we both think that the political system has to deliver for everybody, otherwise people will lose support in it, and you can't win them back simply by going on a radio programme and saying you should be a bit more trusting. People have to feel, it just doesn't work. People have to feel as though there's what's in it for me in this trust is what they're asking.
But we are doing the last ever Finkelvitch. And so we thought we'd look back. We're going to get some listeners on in a minute to ask you some questions, so brace yourselves to that. We thought we'd look back at what we first discussed on the very first edition of Finkelvitch, before it was even before you even christened it Finkelvitch, back in June 2020. Proof that all the way back then, David did once know how to say good morning like a normal person. We're joined now by Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch. Morning, Danny.
Good morning.
Morning, David.
good morning.
The first and last time he's done that. Ever since then, when I've said good morning, you've had a go at me about something or complained in some way. Then, one of the big issues back then was Black Lives Matter, because, of course, it was summer 2020. Socialist infiltration of groups like Black Lives Matter.
I agree with it, but
worry always about how organisations like that end up with a core movement, a bit like Stop the War did, which are taken over by hard left political parties.
Well, the first thing you have to say is there isn't a kind of regulator set up to regulate protest movements. It's not a kind of off-prot.
It just struck me. It was all we talked about that summer, David. Black Lives, well, not all, because there was also a bit of COVID as well, and because of Black Lives Matter and the widespread conversation about black people being treated less fairly, both in America and in the UK, and then it all just got a bit caught up in all you know, and then it's, you know, we've moved on and we've stopped talking about it, despite all the same issues we were talking about then still being there.
I think part of the problem is that so big have been our economic problems and so big have been our international problems that we've found it easier to get entrenched in certain kind of social issues where people are able to take very, very strong positions that satisfy them, that don't actually require a vast amount of consideration or a vast amount of thought. It doesn't mean that anyone are wrong at any kind of given time, but I found it deeply frustrating and find it increasingly frustrating that you'll have continuous debates about statues and traditions and, you know, from one side, and then what's a kind of proper way of speaking, or slamming people for not having a proper way of speaking on the other. So much so that most of us, and the way I would talk about it, if I write about it this week, which I maybe will, most of us get caught in no man's land while these shells are kind of landing, and we're most of us there. It's kind of really weird position. The majority of the population is wandering around in culture wars, no man's land, etc., while these sides kill each other and so on, and it takes up far too much attention and it takes up far too much time.
Well, I essentially agree with that. I do remember when it happened, thinking there was a sort of large faddy element to Black Lives Matter. A sort of friend of mine called it Black Lives Matter for now, and you know, he was trying to capture the fact that soon we'd move on to another movement. But actually, I think in their case, it did leave behind a bit of a you know, certainly I found it. Speaking for myself, I found at a moment where actually I did reflect on how deep and structural racism is. I read quite a lot of people, including Satnam Sangera's book, for example, which really did educate me. And so I learned. So I've always complained when people sort of say this, because this is novel and sometimes a bit over, and sometimes it is taken over by left-wing groups, and sometimes it has, you know, it's a bit sort of over emphatic, and sometimes people stretch it to ludicrous extents, but you still learn something from it if you're listening properly.
And it was definitely true, because partly I think because it was all happening around COVID during lockdowns. And I think people did go off and read books that they might not have done and
Absolutely. I mean, look, some
things.
of them you know, so that there was a vast discrepancy. The book that was Why I Don't Talk to White People About Race. I thought it was interesting to learn her perspective, but I didn't otherwise learn a great deal from it. Whereas Satnam's, I felt I did. Yeah. So I there was sort of, it was quite a wide discrepancy, but still it was good. It was a good debate to have, and we learned some stuff we wouldn't otherwise have done. And sometimes that comes along with people going over the top. You just have to filter that out, I think, a bit.
No, that's definitely true. But but to take Satnam's book, which is a very good book, you then get a whole set of people, and indeed almost kind of whole TV stations set up in the meantime, dedicated to the proposition that books like that are appalling, and that they're terrible, and they don't contribute to debate. They just make white people guilty and stuff like that. And it just
I think crucially, much like the Northern Ireland Protocol, they haven't read it because it's actually just a really interesting history.
Actually, even those people are making sort of valuable points. So actually, the whole debate about statues, I found it very interesting. It makes me think now. Whenever I see a statue, I'm thinking a lot more about what is acceptable for us to keep portraying, or what are we learning for it? Should there be a statue of Clive of India at the bottom of the steps of the Foreign Office or not? I found them, in fact, much more stimulating, and they're not easy to decide upon these things. I do tend to go with those people who think we shouldn't try to take things down just in order to, we basically got a statue of Oliver Cromwell and of Charles II, right? And not with a not very great distance. And both of them.
He means Charles the First, by the way. Although we do
sorry.
somewhere have Charles II.
I apologise, of course, that we do.
Stick with calling him Carl's.
Carl's. I'm so sorry, Charles I. Of course, you're right, David.
Carolus.
But they're not very far from each other, and both of them were massively controversial. The statue of Oliver Cromwell's outside the Commons because the Irish nationalists didn't want it. Inside, the statue of Charles I is at the end of the Mall because obviously it was hidden during the Civil War. So, but we've got both of those, and I think that's a good thing.
Okay, let's move on because I want to get some. Let's get some callers on. I want to speak to Finkelvitch. Philip in Tooting's on the line. Morning, Philip.
Good morning.
What would you like to ask Finkelvitch?
I have a question, but I was just going to say, first of all, David Aaronovitch leaving the Times is a reason for considering my subscription. I'm really, really
Hang on a
sad.
minute. What about me and Danny? What about our columns?
I don't buy the Times on a Thursday or read it avidly on a Wednesday evening. Sorry, Matt, for you, but for David's words of wisdom. So farewell, and I hope we can keep up. Anyway, my question.
Yeah, come on, Philip. Come on.
Yeah.
Before he gets all the sack.
It's about the gap. A lot of people are very interested in politics, and there's a very small subset of us who are very interested in party politics, and the gap between those interested in political issues, whether it's air quality or whatever. And I wanted to know how Finkelvitch think that gap could be closed, and particularly because both of them have moved away from where they were politically originally. I think David's left the Labour Party, and Danny may be still taking the Tory whip, but has a lot of interesting things to say about the state of the Tory party. So how do we close the gap between politics as perceived by the mass of people and party politics as operated by this small
group of slightly peculiar people? Danny?
So a lot of people aren't interested even in those bigger political issues, and they don't have much interest. They let politics a lot of the time go by, and so a lot of phrases that you discuss, even things like should we put a penny on income tax to pay for education? Lots of people think that means a penny altogether rather than a penny in a pound. So a lot of the political debates we have, most people don't engage in, and I think the gulf is so big it's hard to close altogether. But the basic answer is people are interested in things that affect them and their own lives and the lives of their families. That motivates them. So for example, pensioners are strongly across the amount of pension that's being paid, and other people are less interested in it.
David?
The obvious problem here is what you do about the long term, what politicians do about the long term. I mean, I would say if I've learned anything, so many things actually in the last few years, but if I've learned anything, almost all our crises are embedded in not dealing with long-term problems when you should and could have dealt with them. And it's not that nobody noticed, it's just that there was no political premium in doing it. So somehow or other we have to kind of join up in the minds of the voters who are actually going to make a decision about this so that politicians do it, the short and the longer term. Now, climate change is the obvious example here, and we've actually not done that bad a job. Although it's a slight shame, really, that you actually have to have some of the consequences of climate change already in front of you before you do it. But I think that's part of the trust. I'm hoping that people would put more trust in a politician that says, this is tricky, but long term, you can see this is what we're going to have to do.
It was interesting. And I suppose the other problem is that we've spent so long arguing about the thing we're still talking about, Brexit, that all those other long-term issues haven't been addressed either because of bandwidth and political pressure. Let's move on. We've got, thank you for that, Philip. We've got Rebecca in Cambridgeshire. Morning, Rebecca.
Morning.
What would you like to ask Finkelvitch?
Well, my question for Danny and David is, has your co-commentator caused you to change your mind in a material way on any issue as a result of your weekly discussions?
An excellent question, Rebecca. Have either of you changed the other's mind, or had your mind changed by the other?
I wouldn't put it like that. I mean, in quite that way. But it's certainly the case, and you just heard Danny now in fine form on how you might kind of look at the statues debate. There is a quality that Danny has of being able to look at a problem in a slightly kind of different way and being open to it, which I immensely value, and which I've valued a lot, and which does teach me something. As you know, the reason why the Cerberus thing, I think, came about is because I have a tendency really to be slightly more pugilistic occasionally, and Danny has a tendency to be less pugilistic. I think both these things can occasionally be a kind of good characteristics, but are well modified. It's a good idea to modify them.
Yeah.
So imagine you've got kind of, your good angel and your bad angel sitting on your shoulder. I mean, we all think like this. It enables me to have another angel on my shoulder, giving me, said, well, yeah, you might think about looking at it like this. And I think that's just incredibly valuable.
So the answer to your question is that I think every Conservative ought to have a very close friend as I do, in David Aaronovitch, because it means that you can never hold flip opinions designed to kind of appeal to a Conservative crowd without feeling the challenge of Aaronovitch. So these are very valuable to me to make sure that I never accept kind of half suggested arguments that don't actually work. And David and I have had a lot of arguments about immigration where we don't agree, but David's question is always, well, okay, but how do you make what you're suggesting actually work? And he was also the first person to say to me, I mean, I was for Remain in the referendum quite clearly, but he was the first person to emphasise to me how deep the problems would be. And I don't think I'd probably, if you probably just associate with other Conservatives, you get yourself into a debate where, whatever side you're on, you may not appreciate them. So it's something I recommend to everybody, is to have good, close friends that don't always agree with you on everything, and listen to them carefully because they're telling you important things.
That's some top advice. David Aaronovitch, as we say goodbye to David, who's leaving the Times this week. So lots of you have been sending in questions. We'll do some more in a moment. I think we've got Al in West Sussex on the line. Morning, Al.
Good morning. How are we?
I'm very good. What would you like to ask Finkelvitch?
Well, it's been 18 years since David joined the Times, and I wanted to ask...
It was before I was born.
I've got a son who's 18 this week, so yeah, it's a lifetime away. But what's the biggest change been in Britain since David started at the Times?
I mean, as you can imagine, when you're thinking about your kind of valedictorian, whether you're actually going to make it at all, that's precisely what you start thinking about. What are the biggest changes? I started the week before 7/7. And so 7/7 happened in I think week 2 of my being there. Now, if you remember what we were concerned with in 2005 and compare it with what we're concerned with now, it was before the 2008 crash. So a whole series of things, but I think the biggest change that has happened in kind of political terms has been a generational polarisation such as we have never, ever before seen in this country. That really should be telling us more than I think we're currently listening to about it. Now, there are lots of other huge changes, of course there are, but some of them I would have anticipated, like Vladimir Putin turning out to be an extremely bad thing indeed. I just didn't think he was a foolish thing as well, and so on. But I think the biggest thing really has been, I suppose I feel a sense of generational guilt about the situation that we have left younger people in that I didn't feel in 2005.
Danny?
There's no, I think the rise of populism, which is associated with actually the same thing.
And probably dates to the 2008
yes,
crash.
It possibly does, yeah. And I joined the Times actually literally about 2-3 weeks before 9/11. 4 weeks. And so that seemed to be a sort of epoch-making event, but actually by comparison it possibly wasn't, by comparison with a lot of the other things that have happened since. But I think the rise, particularly, it may be that in 30 years' time we reflect on the Republican Party taking the turn that it has in the United States, becoming quite a dangerous political movement, was possibly the most important post-war political happening. But that's just political. I suppose if you're looking at a longer perspective, it'll turn out to be the development of AI.
Yeah, we'll all be replaced by robots. I joined the Times just before Brexit, so we've all had our own things to deal with. Let's do some of the other questions. Steve says, in a tag team wrestling event, who would win, Finkelvitch or Ant and Dec?
Ant and Dec, definitely.
Any sporting competition, I'd definitely come second.
Me too. Yeah.
I've actually was actually the substitute for the under 15B team in one cancelled game. That was for
Last
football,
week.
for football, and that was that's the summit of my sporting achievement. I also came first in the egg and spoon race. And I also defeated Seb Coe in the egg and spoon race.
My summit is
done.
I'm playing for the second 15 for my school rugby team and so on, and I've never scored a try, and I get the ball not far from the try line, and I'm going as fast as I can. Unfortunately, as I move forward, my body gets lower and lower and lower and lower until about 1 yard away from the try line, I fall on my face. And that is the highlight, apart from running the London Marathon, actually. I was okay, but that's not really sporting. That's more kind of...
David did that in an unbelievably short time. What was it? Less under 3 hours?
No, God, no. 4 hours 20... 4 hours 25, 45.
Not quite.
I shouldn't have asked you.
I hardly remember.
What's the most stupid thing you've done at the Times, dressing up wise? We've seen a lot of you in that dressing gown in the spa.
Dressing up wise.
Yeah.
Dressing up in nothing. I mean, but Nicola Gill, the evil genius who runs that side of the Times, etc., one of her missions was to get all the most serious people in the Times, particularly the men, in a state of undress at some point or another and get them photographed.
I did a fake tan. After which I had to go and talk to David Cameron in his lounge, sitting on his and Sam Cam's white sofa with this kind of stuff dripping off me. I felt absolutely... I was sitting right on the edge of it, and then Nicola made me to do a photograph in that Christine Keeler pose. And about 6 months later, my son and his friends did the "Let's have a look of our dads" up on the internet, and they all came up with their chief accountant of some company, or they were worked for the railways, and I came up with a Christine Keeler photograph of me with a suntan.
Makes me dressing up as Theresa May seem quite tame by comparison, because I was still that
was really humiliating. Believe you.
Right, well, on that, what an excellent question from Steve to take us down a very Finkelvitch sort of trip down the memory lane. So what we thought we'd do is let's take a look back over some of David's highs and lows.
Oh, God, not the lows.
Well, they are mostly lows, to be honest, because I put it together. This is, let's go right back to the very beginning when David invented Finkelvitch.
You've said earlier on in teeing up this discussion that Danny and I always disagree. Actually,
we haven't done yet. We're going to be having.
Well, I was going to say
trading
there is something called the
Finkelvitch
that should be called the Finkelvitch conundrum. The Finkelvitch conundrum, which is this: we've never voted the same way, and we actually don't disagree about very much.
Meet the Cerberus of columnists, the Janus of journalism, and the ultimate political portmanteau of opinion.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Finkelvitch, with Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch on Times Radio.
I once really wanted to strangle a busker in Dresden. It's a pity there aren't two Greg hands, aren't there? Then we could talk about a safe pair of hands. And I've now exhausted my level of interest. You know, I was really tempted to give you a nice long bit of radio silence there, just to make you feel nervous.
Very good morning to David Aaronovitch. Morning, David. Now we can hear. Oh, now I can hear. Good morning, Danny.
Good morning. I think David was trying to make a joke, which was kind of lost slightly in the...
Well, it wasn't lost at all. It was millions and millions of people out there got it. What are you trying to suggest? It's so weird. Where are you then?
And beaming in, David Aaronovitch. Morning, David.
How do you know I'm beaming?
He's now back in his bunker. Morning, David Aaronovitch.
Back in the bunker. Everybody else in Britain appears to have met the Queen and to have something to say about it and had to have said it on one outlet or another. And I'm feeling very, very left out. I once went to Hugo Boss and I bought a shirt which kind of yellow background with ducks on it, big ducks. Matt, you're supposed to do this breathily, for God's sake. You're supposed to say, and now the state crown of St. is making its entrance on the purple cushion held by the equerry.
Yes, well, that is all happening. That is all happening. But there are two maces sticking out the window, a bit like somebody going to the dump and they can't shut the boot.
And so what do you prefer? Do you prefer trussists to trussites? Trussites, I think, sounds like something that you kind of, Mary Anning found along the beach in Dorset. That you find, it's a very, very interesting trussite. It seems to have had 1,500 legs and be 8 foot long or something like that. Enjoy this as they tickle your toes at the end end of the bar.
Well, that could have gone on for hours. David, we've got you a little card just to say, which you're allowed to open now, to say thank you for all of your sterling efforts on Finkelvitch, frequently totally undermining the entire premise of the conversation and the format of radio. It's been an absolute delight. And I was really excited when I got to work with David Aaronovitch when I joined the Times. He was one of the ones I'd heard of, this Finkelvitch bloke, and Finkelstein bloke, who slightly passed me by.
Well, it's a lovely card.
Explain
Matt.
what's on the front of your card.
I don't know whether... I've never understood how you get television on radio, etc. But I'm holding this up so that people can see it, etc. But it's a brilliant card. It's got Matt down there. It's got both Danny and I as Cerberus, which I think is right, actually.
It's a three-headed dog. And so we are the three-headed dog.
Or Kerberos.
Or Kerberos.
Or it could be Sard. You a greeting Sard, couldn't it?
Very good. A greeting, Sard.
It's a lovely card, and can I just say this? It's been one of the great pleasures of my career to do this programme with you, Matt. You are a really splendid broadcaster, and Danny is a really splendid friend and foil.
That's right. I mean, no one tunes in to hear you say that, David, by the way. But seriously, working with David Aaronovitch is an absolute joy, and it's a constant stimulation. I'm very happy that we'll carry on being friends, not so happy that we won't carry on.
But I have to tell you, just outside the window there, the coffin has actually now arrived. I'm afraid I'm going to have to go and get in it.
David, it's we will just have to do this over lunch instead, won't we? Without the trouble of trying to stop anyone from swearing. It's been an absolute delight. Gents, thank you so much.